So I have the pleasure today of introducing the moderator for the panel. Her name is Tia Kansara. Tia is an award-winning director of Kansara Hackney Limited. In 2010, she wrote the brief and appointed the architects Foster and Partners for Samba's multi-million-dollar headquarters as the first female to judge a LEED platinum building in Saudi Arabia. She's a co-director of the International Clean Tech Challenge, the Gulf Ambassador of the UCL Bartlett, Siemens List of Future Influencers, and Global Ambassador of the Sandbox Network. Currently, Tia is completing her PhD at UCL Energy Institute in designing future cities whilst creating the first energy baseline in the Gulf. And I'll turn over to Tia now to introduce our other panellists.
Thank you, Brooke. Can you hear me? Great. Welcome to the first panel. I'm delighted to have such a high-quality panel with me today. A very big thank you to the London Business School Energy Club for all the hard work that you've done in coordinating the 10th Global Energy Summit. We're on Twitter, lo and behold. We have 2 Twitter handles that you can tweet us on, thank you, at LBS Energy Summit, and the second is at 2050 City. I'd like to introduce our speakers, after which we will have a short discussion on alternative energy and low-carbon technologies. Then I'll open the floor to the audience to take some questions. The person with the best question gets a little gift from me at the end, so have your questions ready. Now, you say, who are these fantastic panelists? So, I'm going to begin with Ramin. Ramin Dilmaghanian is the Business Development Director for Yingli Green Energy. He's an alumni of LBS with 7 years of experience in the UK solar market, and he's had a hand in setting up his own solar advisory. Akira Kirton is the Ventures Principal for BP Ventures. Apart from his experience in serving over 2 million people with energy solutions in rural India, he has also had the experience of being seconded to the UK Energy Technologies Institute. Scott Lawrence is founding partner of Glennmont Partners Solar Initiatives and has over 7 years of experience in solar power generation and investment. Mike Scholey, CEO of Continental Wind Partners, where he has overseen to completion the largest wind farm in Europe. He has over 20 years of experience in the international power sector and a fellow alumnus of LBS. And finally, Ian Temperton, head of advisory in climate change capital, CCC, where he oversees the M&A transactions. And since 2004, Ian has advised on smart grids, solar, carbon capture and storage, bioenergy, and wind, and also LBS alumnus. I'm really excited today because alternative energy has really taken a turn, as we heard from the previous speaker. I have a combination of questions to the panel, and please feel free to make notes on the questions that you want to ask at the end. I will give you space to do that. My first question is an open question to the panel to kind of get you warmed up. With the rise in environmental concerns, alternative energy has become a somewhat hope giver. To what extent is this statement true or false? I think all of our mics are working. Yeah? Go ahead, panel. Who wants to take the first question? Ramin?
I'll go, yeah. Is this working? Yes, it is a hope giver. I think it's quite important. I was with one of the other panelists the other day in a private conversation, and I said one of the reasons I'd come to the renewable sector, and most of us in renewables are probably less than 10 years old in what we're doing, was, as a search for meaning. So those of you who've taken that course at LBS will be familiar with that particular book. Yeah, meaning, hope, whatever you want to call it. I think it's really important to have a goal to shoot for, and I'd like to see what we're doing sort of beat some of the projections that we've had in the previous speech and come up with some black swans that really change some of the alternative scenarios that we could end up with.
Akira.
Yeah, so I was actually at aside here, at Continental, the AGM for a charity called Mercy Corps. It's the fourth largest NGO in the world, and they deal with issues such as Syria. And it was quite humbling for me to hear that, at the macro level, everyone had huge concerns, but at the micro level, a lot of things are happening that gave hope. So I think Christoph gave an incredibly good overview strategically of some of the macro issues we're seeing, whether that be symphony or not. I guess using his analogy on the jazz side, there's a lot of fantastic work happening on the micro level, and my hope and the hope of alternative energies is such that we aggregate a lot of those. There's no silver bullets, but these little micro happenings scale, and certainly I share the sympathy or sentiment that by 2050 we hit a few balls out the park, so to speak.
Scott.
Yeah, I would say true to the statement as well. I would echo the comment that essentially at the micro level there is a tremendous amount of hope that's given. Solar energy and other types of renewable energy allow for energy democratization. It allows for energy to reach end users that would otherwise not have access to electricity. So I think there is an element of that. At the macro level, I suppose there's some hope as well. If we're trying to decarbonize certain parts of the world or all of the world, this has to be part of the solution. We certainly know it can't be the entire solution, but it is an important part.
Ian.
Yes, of course. I mean, people involved in the international climate process are a pretty depressed bunch at the moment, it has to be said. But, we are in a bottom-up world. We are absolutely in a bottom-up world when it comes to climate at the moment, and there are lots of very positive things that have happened technologically in recent times, certainly with respect to mainstream renewables technology. So if you're a bottom-up kind of person, then there's lots of reason for hope. If you're a top-down, then those guys are a little bit more depressed than the rest of us at the moment.
Mike.
Yeah, I guess it clearly is a feel-good sector, and I suppose part of that's why I moved into it. I spent a bunch of years working in sub-Saharan Africa. There is a feel-good factor there, but it's pretty hardcore as well. And then moved across full-time to renewables. But I think one of the key challenges of the sector, there's lots of challenges obviously in the sector, but one of the key ones is that very feel-good nature of it. Being brutally honest, as somebody who's spent 2 decades now delivering large projects all over the world in sometimes challenging environments, the renewable sector is pretty tricky because there's so many people in the sector purely for the feel-good factor. If you want to say, harsh words, I'd say the average competence level in the renewable sector is pretty low. A lot of people go in there because it feels good, they want to change the world, they're idealistic, and that's all great, that's all fantastic stuff, but there's been a huge degree of learning and a huge degree of capital destruction during that learning process over the past few years that I've witnessed anyway.
Mike, which sectors have gained favour by way of policy and regulations, and which do you feel have not?
Sectors is a tricky one. I mean, I have an analogy that, sorry for people who were here this morning, there was a few mentions of Germany, and I think Germany is a really fascinating example of sort of this microcosm of renewables we're looking at, because I kind of look at the industry, and there's possibly sort of 3 waves in the renewables industry. We had kind of the original wave, which let's call it the 80s and 90s. It was small projects, small vendors making equipment, very idealistic, a lot of people learning, standing on their feet for the first time, a lot of turbines broke, for instance. Then we had, after the turn of the millennium, we had much more kind of industrial renewables, I suppose. We had global competitors, global vendors, big companies. And right now, I think we've almost like come to the end of that second wave, and we're now at the third wave thinking kind of, well, what's next? And Germany's the great example of that. If you look at it, people mentioned it this morning, but if you study Germany right now, there is big public support in Germany for renewables, particularly offshore wind. But there's next to no support in Germany for new investment onshore and new transmission lines, for instance. Well, Germany needs huge transmission line infrastructure and huge grid infrastructure to move the power from the north to the south, because the south's where the load is, the north's where they're going to be generating it. A big disconnect there. The scale of the investment, for instance, is huge in these transmission lines. But at the same time, we have utilities with busted balance sheets. We have announced scale down in near-term targets for the German offshore, from 25 gigawatts in 2030 to 15. Massive scale down. At the same time as the government, got its act together this week, the new coalition was formed, and they signed on to huge targets for 2050. So all these things don't work. And then we have, enormous spillovers in Germany in the sense that we have the renewables crashing the wholesale price, so the wholesale price is essentially, virtually zero. That's killing the utilities. We're exporting those problems now to Poland, to Czech, to Hungary. We're sort of decimating their power sectors, and we're causing huge stranded costs. So the issue is almost like not what sector's going to win out, it's kind of how we kind of square the circle of all these kind of difficult kind of inconsistent policy initiatives and side effects, the stranded costs being a huge one, because if we're destroying the utilities' balance sheets and ability to invest, where's the investment going to come from? The hope is, at least in the broad renewable sector, but not much hope for me, it's hope for my colleague, is I think solar is going to pick up the slack. We deliver large-scale wind projects. We're not really active in solar in the sense of, the term I coined for it is it's democratized. It's a lot of rooftop solar. If you look at the UK, it's men with vans, it's plumbers, it's guys with transit vans who are sticking solar on rooftops. One of our other key markets is Australia. It's going crazy in Australia. So we're getting penetration of renewables, but actually it's not properly integrated, and we're creating more negative externalities that need to be addressed down the road.
Thank you, Mike. I had a few nods from Ramin and Scott. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess part of it is about the democratization of energy. I mean, if the issues are in transmission and power lines and huge investments there, just disconnect from it, in the sense that I work for a solar company and have done for a number of years in the sector. I'm a one-trick pony. I would tell you that it's the answer to absolutely everything. It's not. It's clearly not, right? But it's got lots of things going for it. And to the extent that you can localize energy production and hopefully at some point in the near future combine it with energy storage, why couldn't individual houses bring their energy costs down to near zero from a point of view purchasing it from the sort of incumbents? So that's I think solar has a big part to play. I mean, it's not a direct answer to your question, but just following up on what was said, I think.
Sticking to the kind of microgeneration aspect of things, would you say that's a good business model? And if you could see it as a sort of the next big thing, could you combine microgeneration with a renewable energy mix, like a fuel mix?
Clarify for me the last bit.
Like a local, we're talking about microgeneration as an area of development. Could it be that we combine, say, solar technology with wind energy on a local scale, and how could that happen?
Absolutely. Solar clearly isn't a panacea. It's people always ask the question, what happens when the sun goes down? So you combine it in some way, shape, or form with either very localized storage, such as at the house level or at the industrial unit level, or at a localized level. Then I think it's the combination of things. And one of the things that was said about the UK's AAA rating was that it had this diversity of generation. I think almost through inability to make a choice, frankly. I mean, if you were Germany, they just made the choice and they're going down the symphony route. We can't stick to a decision. I think that's the reason we've ended up where we've ended up. But it's turned out that it gives us diversity, and that's a good thing. So I advocate the diversity. Solar is, as one of my former colleagues used to say, is not a magic bullet, but it's a pretty good bullet, and it can tick a lot of boxes. So
anybody else?
But I hand over to.
So you can't predict the future, but we should definitely look at what the history of the industry was and what are some of the current signals that we're receiving in the industry. And we look back to maybe the year 2007, where let's say we purchased a megawatt of solar modules, and just the modules themselves, not the rest of the power plant, but just the modules themselves here in Europe were probably costing €3.5 million for a megawatt. And let's say today, well, we use not the real cost, but the European duty on Chinese modules coming into the European Union, and we're looking at 560,000 euros for that same megawatt of modules. And so this is a massive sea change in the cost of the technology, which means that what we all thought was going to be the future in 2005 and 2006 is completely different today, and our outlooks are completely different today. Now, when you talk about the third wave and the way that solar is going, and it's the plumbers and the installers who are going into let's say residential buildings and houses and things like this. There's certainly a place for that, and I think it also speaks to the simplicity of the technology. And I think it is the simplicity in the technology that's been responsible for the massive layers or levels of growth that we've seen. It's not complicated. The mystery work is done in the factory. Once you get the solar module out to the end user, out to the field that you're putting it in, it really is a type of plug-and-play solution. And this means that it can be used many, many places very, very quickly at an increasingly competitive cost. And because it is so simple, it's also removing itself from traditional project finance markets. And I think this is something where we will see a real change in the world. No longer will solar energy be in the realm of, let's say, wind farms or even traditional power where you go to your bank and you arrange a long-term project financing. Rather, you're looking more maybe to the real estate market. This is something where, let's say, there's a different type of loan structure available. I think we're going to see, well, solar bonds already being issued here in the UK. I think it's not too much time, not to use a dirty word, until we see asset-backed securities and CDOs coming to that space as well. And this will really accelerate growth, I think, on a global basis.
I'll just jump in quickly as well. Going back to Africa, I mean, we've seen, or those of you, I mean, it's a case study in business schools, isn't it? The progress of telecoms and mobile telephony in rural areas. It's not just Africa, it's parts of Central America, it's parts of India, and the revolution that brought. Well, solar's going to do the same. I mean, solar is already being used to charge mobile phones, isn't it, in remote villages and storing it in car batteries. I mean, there is that entrepreneurial drive there. So I think solar, at least in the short term, has the power to revolutionize large parts of the planet, which are currently kind of essentially unserved by the modern energy industry. I think that's a fantastic thing.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess building your point, Tia, around microgeneration, I think I would actually reframe it as sort of micro-demand, right? So what do consumers really want? They want cooking, they want lighting, they want heating, they want transport. They don't always care about whether it's an electron, whether it's a transport fuel that's a petroleum-based fuel, etc. So the sector that has had the most prominence and uptake, but silently, really is on demand in buildings, right? So in the UK alone, around 30 to 40% of all energy and CO2 emissions are genuinely heat in homes and industrial buildings. The UCL Energy Institute, of which you're part of, obviously does a lot of work in that area, but it's buildings insulation, it's thermal tapping, it's that boring thing called loft insulation. These things are exceptionally good in payback. They reduce consumption. So as important it is in these panels to think about supply side, generation, distribution, actually improvements in reduction of demand, even at the micro scale, are actually having a transformative effect. So.
You were telling me recently about the water technologies that you're working on. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, slightly different, I guess, non-traditional alternative energy area, but just a couple of statistics to frame the water question in oil and gas. So I heard an earlier question around fracking and the use of water in fracking, but just very openly, if you speak to the National Water Council, etc., then around 4 to 10 barrels of oil are produced for every 1 barrel of oil. 4 to 10 barrels of water produced for every 1 barrel of oil that's produced in most generic production. So the need to improve on manners to clean up that water to make sure that if it were indeed returned, it's returned unsoiled, that's an incredibly important question that the extractive industries have been grappling with. Of course, everyone meets regulations, but sustainable companies want to go beyond that. So actually the industry is working on that, and if you want to expand and use the word clean tech, then clearly that's an area that's really important and will no doubt grow.
So I'm pro microgeneration, but we do have to be slightly realistic. So there's the chief scientist at the Department for Energy and Climate Change in the UK, is a guy called David Mackay. If you've not read his book, you should. If you can't be bothered to read his book, you should watch his TED Talk, in which he says, "I'm not anti-renewables, but I am pro-arithmetic." And And we do have to understand the enormous amount of energy that we are going to have to harness through renewable sources if we're to replace hydrocarbons. And so, whilst distributed energy has its place, the instant energy in urban places is not sufficient to power your lives. So we are not going to be able to get away from harnessing vast amounts of industrial scale renewable energy, whether that in Northwest Europe is in the sea or whether it's solar deployed at massive industrial scale in places with competitive amounts of solar irradiation. So whilst I think it's all good and it's all very empowering, but we're not going to replace this big dirty industry with anything other than an even bigger industry, hopefully, which is a lot cleaner.
I could just pick up on that. I mean, I agree with you completely, but I was drawing the parallel with Germany, where things are pretty uncertain right now. In every country we operate, and the cycle time, if you like, from when we start work on a project, which is when we identify a site, I suppose, stick up a wind mast, do all the permitting work, the environmental stuff, until we can break ground, is probably 4 years. So I'm only looking for a 4-year degree, a 4-year piece of certainty on a framework where I find the site until when I can sort of raise the finance and start building the wind farm. And I'm struggling to find markets anywhere in the developed world where I can get 4 years of certainty. So, half of my projects, by the time, I've finished the wind monitoring, finished the environmentals, got the permits sorted out, they've changed the rules or they're revising the rules or something else, and I can't attract this skittish capital to the market. So it's incredibly hard right now in most jurisdictions to mobilize the capital to support the large-scale industrial projects, which is why I'm sort of singling out the democratization, the small scale, the solar, the rooftop solar as being kind of one of the few areas of bright hope right now, because the large-scale renewables is proving very, very hard to deploy, certainly in places, except in places like China, where clearly they're doing it on a altogether different degree.
Scott, what would you say about that with your experience, I think, in Central America?
Yeah, well, I would
US.
say certainly I would agree with that Europe is always challenging and becoming more so. Part of that as a lot of, let's say the best sites are already taken, and also because regulators do become skittish and change their mind quite often. I would say, however, we are seeing some bright spots, Latin America being one example, where we look at Chile and we look at the last couple of weeks and we see the first project financing that was done on a merchant basis. So quite literally that is a large-scale industrial solar power plant without a feed-in tariff, financed on a merchant basis. Now, fair enough that is a multilateral bank who's coming in and providing the financing for it, but I think this is an interesting sign. And what it means is the right technology and the right market with the right resource, combined with the right background power prices, starts to make renewables pretty compelling on a large-scale basis, to the extent we can keep the regulator out of it.
I'm seeing some really interesting challenges in Abu Dhabi, where I'm currently focusing on with my PhD, with regards to the built form expanding at the rate that it is, with the cost of desalination and the use of electricity in the actual built form. I'm interested in what your views are on that, Akira, because of the sort of Middle Eastern experience that you've had.
So it's a broad question. Certainly issues in regards to water seem to be a prominent factor in the Middle East, and certainly, as an operator, there's increasingly a pressure, the right pressure, to try and resolve and ensure that the water balance remains untouched, and we're doing something more powerful. I'll give an example. Actually, one of our portfolio companies, is a company called Scholey Technologies. BP is an investor. We own around 6% of shares in that company. And Christoph mentioned cement is the thing that no one wants to talk about in these conferences, right? Because it's the second largest single point source emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. So this is a company that actually has been able to create a cement that actually uses CO2 to cure. Cement absorbs CO2. So actually, you may or may not be aware, you need water to cure cement normally. So significantly reduces water, but also actually captures CO2 into the concrete. And certainly that company has been spoken to a number of outfits in the Middle East who are very keen to use that technology. We are seeing a huge drive by groups such as Mazda and others to really drive forward with key sustainability themes. So that's a micro example of the kind of things that can happen if there's enough will and excitement.
How about Europe?
Harder because the built environment's old. So So, I mean, the thing about insulation, microgeneration, building integrated technologies, if you do them first, they're a no-brainer. If you retrofit them, it's a lot harder and it's a lot more expensive. So for those who've been on Mars for the last few weeks, there's been a row in the UK about effectively a scheme where we retrofit poor people's houses with energy efficiency measures and its cost and what that's doing to bills and the fact that utilities don't like it. And it's a function of the fact that the building stock in the UK is old. It wasn't done to modern standards in the first place, and retrofit is always more expensive. So if you've got a chance to do it first in Abu Dhabi, do it first.
I suppose that's the case with Mazda as well, leading some sort of experimentation in the desert. I find that with energy, the cost of electricity, especially sticking to Abu Dhabi, can be really high. And the subsidies that the government is spending to reduce the load on the consumer is actually quite scary. So long term, with the expanse of the city, they're concentrating on ways to diversify their income from oil, but also looking at ways of reducing the subsidy burden over time. Do you find that in alternative energy that there is a way that we could help reduce the subsidy, and which technologies would actually survive past that?
That was thrown up, I think it was in the BCG presentation. You can see, Northern European countries approaching grid parity just purely on the cost of electricity to the end consumer. So it doesn't take much to drive you towards those kinds of frontiers and just be able to achieve them. Again, just to be boring, solar is quite a good solution. In that context, but clearly it's not the only one. So I think there's clearly the Sunbelt countries. You want to go there first if you're in the Middle East. It's rather strange to be having geopolitical security discussions in Geneva about one kind of form of energy which has two potential uses, and yet there's all this solar resource that could be used to power the country. So, I just think you're a lot closer to grid parity with renewables in a whole heap of places than we perhaps give it credit for. So.
Yeah, I find this whole debate, and maybe focus on the UK, about the tariff rises in the power sector and the extraordinary cost of electricity in the UK, I find it really, really annoying, to be quite honest. If you actually look at the Office of National Statistics, the ONS, look at their website, and they have breakdowns of household expenditure in the UK, what you find is the average household in the UK spends the same on communications, i.e. mobile phones essentially, or broadband, as they do on electricity. And either of those, both of those, are about a quarter of what we spend on hotels and restaurants per year, on average across the whole country. The problem is, it's almost like the very success of the energy industry, isn't it? It's kind of become boring, it's predictable, everyone takes it for granted. And maybe this is the issue we need to address, is less arguing about kind of green power and subsidies and this kind of stuff, is sort of go back to basics and say, two of the most fundamental kind of improvers of life in any society, provision of clean water, clean sanitation, because the water companies have the same problem, and the power sector. And, the very success of these companies, I mean, they're huge long-term capital-intensive industries, and they're being kicked around like political footballs every single day. It's ridiculous. And that's the debate we should be having, rather than saying kind of, who's going to win out in the long term, or that kind of combined cycle plants are not counting the externalities of the CO2 and, all this stuff, The reality is the power sector is incredible value for what it provides, and that's just underappreciated.
Ramin.
I agree. I just wonder what your view is on the fact that those things are absolute necessities in life, such as water and power, unlike perhaps telecoms, should be under national control as opposed to under private control.
That's a big philosophical point, isn't it? But I think they're incredibly good value either way, and that's kind of lost in the modern debate.
No, they clearly live in a very difficult place, and the market's changing around them, where large organizations like that don't have the ability to turn on a coin, and that's one of the challenges. People can change behaviors really quite quickly. Organizations much tougher.
But the challenge comes back to, again, it's I'm sorry, it's those boring words, isn't it? It's kind of policy and leadership, isn't it? It's leadership in terms of explaining to people why things are the way they are, and to some degree stop whinging and grow up a little bit and get used to paying your power bill, as well as kind of implementing sensible policy in the whole sector, because energy is too important for this kind of chaotic melange that we're trying to muddle through right now. We just look at Europe. I mean, we have stated goals in carbon reduction. Every country's doing it differently. We can't even tell which countries are ahead and which are behind on their targets, the EU targets, 2020 targets. The mix of solutions is different. It's kind of chaos out there, and it's barely working, isn't it? Let's be honest. We should be doing better.
So I disagree with that a little bit, I have to say. I think I seem to spend half of my life explaining what amounts to sort of 4 or 5 instances in Europe where we've had some slightly difficult policy stuff, that I think the majority of policies in this arena are pretty stable. And I think as lower risk and as investable as you will get in many other parts of the energy sector. I think we have to be very clear. There are definitely no forms of unsubsidized power generation in the world, and there are probably no forms of unsubsidized energy. So the debate that characterizes renewables as this thing which is sort of expensive and subsidized and everything else is the market is frankly ridiculous. And so, I'm very happy to have a debate with conventional power generators about where the subsidies go, but the idea that there aren't any in those sectors is completely daft. The problem is that in renewables we operate effectively under the governance of civil society in a way that lots of other industries don't to quite the same extent, and therefore the subsidies that go to renewables are extremely transparent. Everybody knows now in the UK that there's £112 on the bill and 30 of it is the renewables obligation. Well, you can't find that anywhere for most of the other technologies we use to generate power, or energy for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perennial debate. Do you back a horse, or do you try and just allow the market mechanisms based on governance to promote the appropriate technologies and allow entrepreneurs to develop in this sort of, I guess, hybrid jazz symphony model? I'll go for a little bit more of a tangent, just because I think it's always worthwhile taking a world view. This is the Global Energy Summit. I did work in India, Vietnam, China, and South Africa, working with what's traditionally called bottom-of-the-pyramid type customers, developing a business in India that we subsequently spun out of BP and still serves 2 million people. For those people earning $3 to $10 per day, energy's about a third of their annual income expenditure. A third, right? That's including transport, heating, cooking, lighting. So it's massive, right? It's great in Western civilization for all of us to enjoy the fact that we have discretionary income to do other things, but it's very real and quite poignant. The reason I mentioned Vietnam, however, is therein lies some of the symphony of China and Vietnam. When we were working in Vietnam, I recall in October, I think it must have been about 2007, walking around and everyone was on their motorcycles and no one had helmets, right? Because they didn't do that. I came back in December the 15th, same year, and apparently December 1st, the Vietnamese government said everyone must wear helmets, and literally the entire population in Vietnam, everywhere we walked, everyone had a helmet. Now bear in mind, some of these are watermelons painted black because they couldn't afford a helmet. But in reality, mass deployment based on very strict regulations. Moving much closer to home, in our industry, sulfur in petrol was removed by regulation, not by subsidies, and we just conformed. Yes, it made things slightly more expensive, but we just conformed. So yes, subsidies may be useful. Regulation, the other form of regulation, may be more powerful. So.
And with that, we're going to hand over the floor to the audience. I can see some really smiley faces and everyone's got lots and lots of questions. We have a lady at the front with a mic. Who would like to go first? Please could you introduce yourselves when you're asking the question so that we know who you are.
Hi, good morning. It's Michael Salmon, an alumnus from the school. It strikes me, this is my perception, so it might be wrong, your comments would be welcome, but my perception is that the alternative energy industry is fragmented, populated by lots of small companies, lots of divergent objectives. And yet you exist in an industry where there's government and large incumbents. And so my question is now the right time for the alternative energy industry to become a bit more like the incumbents so that governments can deal with you? Or is now the time to remain the unruly stepbrother?
I would say the question is are you asking about the world today or the world of 5 years ago? In the world of 5 years ago, I would agree that it was hyper-fragmented. I would take it a step further, and I would say it was a time period of cowboys and criminals, and quite a few of those. Any kind of one-man band in a country could go find a parcel of land and work with his local municipality, and before you know it, he was a solar developer or a wind developer and able to put a project together. The market has moved on considerably, and you have very large global players who are now moving capital in this space. And so is it time to become like a utility? Well, I'm not sure. Let's see which business models emerge, but where are the capital flows coming from? And the capital flows are coming ultimately from large pension funds and insurance companies. And they're channeling that money into renewable energy projects across the globe, either directly or through intermediaries like fund managers like ourselves, or sometimes through the equipment manufacturers themselves. And so the industry is growing up, and the ultimate sources of capital are the players that you would hope them to be at the end of the day.
I think if it's about having a voice that can speak to governments, that's sort of already happened. You only have to look at the EU-China solar trade case to realize that this thing reached the levels of Angela Merkel and senior politicians, and it came on their radar, and it was with their intervention that it was sort of bumbled and half kind of dealt with. But there was certainly shuttle diplomacy at that level. So if it's about having a voice, I think the industry already has a voice. How it can probably learn a lot from the incumbents, but hey, we're new, so I think you can cut us some slack there. But I think there's no avoiding the sector anymore, and that's the big sea change that I think I would agree with Scott on.
I'd say I think maybe needs most when the devil drives. One place we operate in is Australia. We have quite a big kind of operation in Australia, and if you followed the politics in Australia, there was an election earlier in the year. Labour Party got thrown out. National Liberal Coalition came in. They pledged to do whatever it took to abolish the carbon tax, and Renewables is now caught up in this. They have a series of kind of effectively targets, a bit like the European targets. But the removal of the carbon price, or the threat of removal of the carbon tax, and hence the lack of clarity on the carbon price, affects future projections for wholesale markets, projects therefore the financeability of all the wind farms. And wind is the large-scale wind technology of choice in Australia, though solar, as I say, is catching up mainly on rooftops. In Australia, it's it's a good example because you've got a very, very strong coal lobby there because the country exists largely by exporting huge amounts of things, including coal. There's some energy-intensive industry. It was a very politicized, let's say, electoral issue, this whole carbon tax. And I guess it really forced us, as we aren't the biggest by a long stretch, but it forced us and probably 14 of our best friends to form a sort of a coalition of the large people with interest in renewables in Australia and really start kind of lobbying, not for special treatment, but try and get consistent treatment in all the things we're asking for, clear policy, long-term horizons, and consistent application. So we aren't merging our businesses, but in the key issues that affect the industry, we've gone literally overnight from being kind of disparate voices and fighting for our own projects, and occasionally, we were selling power to other guys who were buying it, to there's now an existential threat, and we've joined together to deal with this in a sort of consistent manner and try and, arbitrage between ourselves and argue out the differences. So it can happen, but I think the scale of the board we're playing in, the country, the countries, the world, the industry, I think Renewables, for the foreseeable future, will remain, small voices in a much larger kind of palette.
So yes is the answer. So if we're to replace utility power generation with something that's going to be vastly more capital intensive, which all low carbon energy sources are, then that's going to need players created bigger than the utilities that exist at the moment. Unfortunately, that's not as hard as it used to be, as the utilities have managed to be shrinking themselves quite substantially in recent years. But yeah, no, absolutely, consolidation required. It is difficult for policymakers, I think, when they get to difficult times, to know who they're doing a deal with. You couldn't do in the renewable sector the kind of deal which the newspapers and radio stations are full of this morning in the UK about the government talking to the big six, right? That's a much more difficult conversation, and I think certainly some of the more challenging renewables, that's absolutely necessary, otherwise the deal won't get done.
Yeah, I mean, I think fragmented perhaps in numbers, maybe not fragmented in purpose, would be my answer. And clearly, theoretically, being part of BP Alternative Energy, we are the cowboys within BP, if you think about it that way. But over our time, we created about 2005, 2006. We spent $7.5 billion on renewables. If you look at statistics provided by Bloomberg, so BNEF, then $1 trillion has been spent in this sector, right, globally. So I guess the sector, we probably believe we've actually moved up, we've matured, we're no longer children, we're probably more teenagers, upstarts moving on to university and about to knock on the door of the big boys. So as a sector, that's what we feel. Perhaps the question does highlight that others may not view us that way. So that's... Yeah.
More questions? Yeah, gentleman at the back with the light blue shirt.
Hi, my name is Danica Cerebus, and I'm a graduate of the MBA from Imperial College Business School, and also a mechanical engineer. Just to summarize what happened with the European policy in the renewable energy during the last 20 years, what happened is that during the last 5 years, especially in the south, like Italy, Spain, Greece and Portugal, the European energy strategy was applied, and they drove to very strong subsidies, both in capital terms per kilowatt hour and also for the funding capitals for wind and solar. So we had the phenomenon that, for example, in Greece, they gave a price which was about 8 to 9 times more than the price of the market. Something similar happened also to the other countries. Then the crisis came, and we saw that the king is naked in Europe. I mean, the number one problem of Europe, and especially the South, is the competitiveness of their economies, and one of the factors is also the energy. And as Mr. Fry said before, what we are seeing now is that the new strategy for the future of Europe, for the energy future of Europe, is to support the CCS technology, which, according to a German expert, high-level academic expert, makes sense only with 50 euros per ton in CO2 or more. So my question is very clear. Where does this drive? What's the future of Europe? And if you ask me, is that the demand for Australian passports between the young people of Europe, I'm afraid, is going to rise. Thank you.
So being an Australian, Brit, and an American, all three passport holders, then I seem to be managing to stay in Europe. So and it's I'll obviously have some level of faith in what will go forward. And again, our company BP, along with Statoil, actually operate one of the world's only CCS plants, right, in Ansala in Algeria. So I guess a lot of dialogue has happened on the international circuit and on the scene around CCS, and actually quote work done by the ETI when I was there, which aligns with what Christoph said. It certainly would be required in order to hit the genuine 2050 emissions targets that we would all like to see. I guess one of the philosophical debates is when do you deploy it, and at what point and at what cost, and a lot of the philosophical debates, do you do energy efficiency measures first? Do you actually push forward with things like solar and wind and others? And at the right stage, when economies are in the right place, do you then try and bring in the technologies that may be later stage game changers? It's a big debate that's happening. I'm not convinced anyone's actually drawn themselves to a conclusion. Certainly, if you look at the McKinsey work, then theoretically, 50% of emissions reductions could be done using best available technology over the next 20 years. So, yeah.
The question was slightly broader than that, wasn't it? I mean, we've seen, if you look at the past 10 years in Europe, you've seen retail energy prices rise by almost 50% in Europe. In the US, they've more or less stayed the same. So we've reduced our competitive position massively against the US in that basic area of applying electricity to factories and households and everything else. Now, admittedly, the US found shale gas and we went long renewables, but that's a startling statistic. But I mean, at the same time, we've created, again, just in my sector, 3 of the top 5 wind turbine manufacturers in the world are European. So it's Siemens, Vestas, and Enercon. Then there's GE, the biggest currently in the world, but GE manufactures a big chunk of its stuff in Germany anyway. So, what's the long-term value we've created in Europe through kind of really originally the Germans and the Danes sort of championing this wind industry? It's hard to say, isn't it? Because if you look at future projections of installation of wind turbines, the industry is starting to move out of Europe, if you like. The projections going forward at kind of Asia and South America and other places will start to pick up in terms of installations. So there's possible value we've created there in terms of the manufacturing base in Europe, but we've done it at the expense of developing the technology by the early stage, relatively high cost projects, and we're still living with those legacy costs, aren't we, with higher energy prices?
Not everybody in climate change is trying to get an Australian passport at the moment, I don't think. Southern Europe, so a number of Southern European countries subsidised their industries to an excessive extent, didn't tell their populations that they were doing that, racked up a load of debts and then struggled to pay them back. I mean, with the greatest respect to Southern Europeans present, renewables was not the only industry in which they did that. So I don't think the machinations that come from what's happened in Southern Europe or some Southern European countries, mainly Spain, really reflects on renewables or reflects on European renewables personally. I think it's a macroeconomic thing. CCS, so I've been doing CCS since I had hair, and it's a very, 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 very long time ago. And it comes back to the point, I think, that I've made a couple of times in the gentleman's question there. I mean, that is massive industrial scale undertakings, and at the moment, Europe just doesn't have massive industrial scale enterprises with either the capital or the skills to deploy it, and that's a massive problem. And that's the big issue in CCS, and we're going to have to find a way to solve it. But that's a whole, if someone wants to ask 6 more questions about CCS, we can do that. But for the moment, I'll shut up about it.
Gentleman supporting Movember, could you put your hand up again?
How do you know he is?
Well, he's got this beautiful moustache. Why not?
Could be permanent.
Thank you. I'm still taking donations. If you, I can send you the link.
Love it. Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Patrick Fitzgerald. I'm a first-year MBA at London Business School. My question is about China's latest symphony. So you'll have seen that they've announced the expansion of their carbon trading scheme in the last few days. My question to you all is whether you think, there's been a lot of discussion about China's ability to achieve transformation within very short timetables in different industries. My question to you is whether you think this expansion of the program will lead to transformation, or whether, like Vietnam, this is just another case of watermelons.
I suppose I'm in the firing line working for a Chinese company, but every time I go there, I'm surprised at how unsymphonic the whole thing feels. I think they're clearly good at supporting big centralized initiatives, and I don't know the detail of this one, but if they're minded to, yes, they will drive something through. But I think they're also suffering from, the third point in the first presentation, which was the social impact of not doing certain things. Every time I go there, the air is not particularly clean, and I'm not just talking about Beijing. If you go outside, it still feels very similar, certainly in the industrial cities. And people are beginning to, there's a backlash there to some extent. So I think their hand is forced, and they do things centrally. So I think if they're minded to, it probably will have a pretty significant impact. But yeah, I mean, as a single player where they consume a lot of energy, they produce a lot of it in the old conventional ways, and that's just not sustainable, then they have to do something. And I think what they know, the hammer they have in the toolkit is a kind of a symphonic approach. And you know, we'll have to wait and see. I wouldn't wish to stick my neck out and predict.
Any more? No. Okay, Brooke, where are you? We have a gentleman at the front with the stripy socks. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Tasos Vlasopoulos. I'm actually from the General Electric company. So it's more of a comment rather than a question to the panel. I do believe that there is a future for a lot of these technologies across the power generation sector. Okay. Although I'm in the oil and gas business of GE, I do believe that there is future for gas turbines, for gas engines, for wind, for everything, depending on the regional structure. There may be different things in Europe, in Southern Europe, versus Northern Europe. Different things in the US, different things in China. One comment back to the comment back to what Iordanis said earlier on. You know, Philip Lowe of the Director General of the EU on energy matters had said that they think that the incentives given across the EU, or the push for incentives for different renewable energies, should be orchestrated in the future so that the Northern European countries do not have subsidies for solar, whereas the Southern European countries should have subsidies of solar. On the other hand, my home country, Greece, always had retail prices for electricity very, very low to subsidize socially the structure, and therefore it effectively killed the solar business, whereas it could have worked there. So the political structures, the policies, the wider machinations, I think, lead to different distortions in the marketplace. That's my comment as Tasos Vlasopoulos, but not as GE. Okay?
Any comments on that?
Just one observation on that is, you know, as we've heard before, energy is subsidized in all sorts of ways. I'm not sure there is any such thing, if I can be controversial, as the market. I mean, why are the energy prices so low in Southern Europe, where naturally they would not be? The point is, naturally they are where they are. That is the nature of it, right? And it's very difficult to unpick all these things. Solar works in Northern Europe because the retail prices of electricity are high. That's the nature of it. That is the market. However fiddled, artificial, or subsidized you think it is, where the numbers fall is, you know, you can't argue with the arithmetic, I guess, is the point.
This is basically Adam Smith, though, isn't it? I mean, isn't it about specialism? And it doesn't make sense, really, to be kind of building solar plants, you know, to be honest, in the UK, really. It isn't that sunny in the UK, as we all know. But I mean, at the policy level, this is going back to, it works. It works, obviously, economically it works because the tariff supports it. But the policy framework is where we need a lot of work. And this is where, again, you know, defend the European Commission and the EU, because they have a huge role to play here in kind of trying to unpick this. Because it's actually very, very difficult right now to actually, if you like, kind of, you know, use these statistical transfer mechanisms to move the greenness from the energy you generate in Greece to somewhere like Holland. You know, even though, you know, Holland is most likely going to struggle to meet its EU targets, other places can over-generate relatively cheaply, but it's hard to move the benefit of that across Europe. So those mechanisms will enable, if you like, kind of, you know, transnational, you know, green attributes to be moved. But right now it's practically virtually impossible to achieve that inside the EU.
You know, I think there are three key areas that will actually affect the future of the industry, power gen and oil and gas business. One is the technologies that will be developed in the transportation business, where the use of oil is actually important, the storage business and the fuel sales business. This is the areas that will actually be the destructive forces across, you know, what will, you know, happen in the future in the power gen and in oil and gas. So in the areas of renewables, I think energy storage and fuel cell will be something which will be very critical to how penetration will actually in the marketplace will take place, in my opinion.
Yeah, potentially yes, potentially no. Let's see what the future holds. One thing I will say about the regulators in general in Europe is they've become much more adept at understanding what are the underlying technologies vis-a-vis several years ago. I mean, we talk about the case of Spain, and we talk about the problems with the solar market there. You can go back and you can read Royal Decree 661 on the internet, and you can see that they intended to have something like 400 megawatts at this rate, and they ended up getting 3,000 megawatts or 3,500 megawatts at this same subsidized rate. And so there was some learning that was to be done, and subsequent versions of legislation brought that down and became more reflective. And I think other countries made similar mistakes, but these mistakes were things in the past, and current levels of legislation are much more in tune with markets and making a lot more sense with what is the underlying technology. Now, as for what makes it more penetration of renewables into Europe in general, I mean, storage is a great thing globally. If somebody can crack that and make it work on an economical basis, of course. Fuel cells, yeah, let's see. There have been many people who have made fortunes and quickly lost them right afterwards in that industry.
I think in Europe you have to kind of figure out the journey, right? At the risk of sounding like a Strictly Come Dancing contestant. So at the moment we have national policies. Those are things that investors rely on. That leads to irrational outcomes in where resources are deployed and harnessed, but it's only better than the alternative, which would be going immediately to something pan-European, which would be lowest common denominator. Investors wouldn't know who they were dealing with and would run a complete mile. So the fact that we've had national responsibility, national support mechanisms, and certain countries have been allowed to take leadership in these areas is a good thing, and it's got us there much faster than the Puritan economists will pretend that we would have got there if we'd had a single market. So there is, particularly now that cost is a big issue across Europe, there's a little group of economists who've appeared, bless them, who decide that everything has to be a market. Well, nothing's a market in energy. So, and that we should have sort of equal pricing across everywhere. And like I say, that's where we will get to eventually, and we will get to rational investments across the continent, but you won't get there by the Puritan economist route. You just won't.
So, yeah, I mean, I think Christoph's trilemma was quite a useful frame, right? Energy security, effectively, sustainability and affordability. And if you look across the planet, most nations that are strategic are optimizing based on 2 or 3 of those principles, right? And so the US, the shale gas is really a push for energy security, right? The predictions are the US will be energy secure with shale gas and tight oil, certainly in the 2020 to 2030 timeframe. And that's massive for the US. Potentially 1 to 2% increase in GDP, and a lot of jobs in urea, ammonia manufacturing, and other areas. So you then play that on a European scale, then each country ultimately, if they're being strategic, will be looking at their own resources and saying, well, what technologies or areas should we back? The UK, whether rightly or wrongly, was quite a big early adopter for offshore wind. Why? Because the UK believes it has the second largest offshore wind bank in the entire world, right? So it has gone and said, we want to be strategic, we want to develop something, whether it ends up being economic or not, we will find out, right? So the question is, can you then aggregate 27 sovereign nations into having one opinion on which ones to back? And that's just international diplomacy and discussions and dialogue, which as we know, sometimes succeeds and sometimes doesn't, right? So.
I think that's the point I was making at the start about these 3 waves, moving to the third wave, which is to get significant penetration of renewables beyond where we are right now in places like Germany, which is clearly a stated goal that I think everyone's signing on to, takes that kind of degree of cooperation. It needs to be there at the next level. It needs to be there in transmission and market design and specialism. So to get to anywhere approaching the targets by 2035, 2050, whenever, we need to move to that next level.
I think my ultimate view is it's harmonization for harmonization's sake. I mean, that's the tool in their toolbox, and they want to harmonize everything. And actually, this is one of the areas where you need localization much more.
I didn't say about harmonization. I said that there are regional specifications that will pick the right technologies for different countries, for different regions.
Yeah, but if I think you're referring to the document that I think you're referring to, then you know the gist of it is, you know, we want one template and we want to be known for that template. We want everyone to, you know, localize but abide by our templates, or whatever the local content rules were, you know, need to be removed and all of that, and people won't want to do that kind of thing if it doesn't suit them.
Great example of why more international dialogue needs to happen goes back to, again, Christoph's point around energy storage in Europe, right? So most nations in Europe are banking on the fact that they can connect this lovely Scandinavian storage hub. I know the UK is, right? So is France. So you add up the aggregate assumptions that each country's making, and you'd need 3 times the Scandinavian storage hub, right? So the dysfunctional harmony around these kind of matters isn't helping. Yeah.
My name is Sheyi Olakulei. I'm in my first year in the MBA program at LBS. In similar fashion to the first question we had, I was wondering if it is time for the renewable energies to start focusing on integration with the conventional energy systems. I ask this because based on the responses to the first question, some of the renewable energies are not in a position to overtake the conventional systems, and also because, as we can see in most developing nations, governments prioritize development over issues around climate change. And so the question will be, is it now time to start focusing on integrating renewables with conventional energy and kind of building an industry around it so that services can be given and recommendations can be made based on the options available in a particular location and the logistics for transmission and distribution, so that, say, you could give advice to a government to bring together a couple of systems to achieve the most efficient energy solution possible? And what will your reaction be to a scenario in a integration services world where the recommendation is given that a government or a location should not go into any renewable project, but should probably focus on developing batteries to solve transportation and household problems? Will that be a possibility in which advice will be given, do not bother with renewables, just focus on conventional and probably storage of electricity?
Akira.
I'm trying to synthesize all the elements of that question. So some of that's happening, I think would be my response. So people talk about energy storage, and yes, you can pump water up a hill and bring it down again, and you know that's one form of energy storage. One of David Mackay's exciting projects with ETI is a company called Isentropic that takes heat from one lake, puts it into another, and again, that's a really exciting way of thinking about energy storage. But another way of thinking about energy storage is you have gas, you put it into a turbine, and when the intermittency in wind or solar is happening, you shove in that gas to fill in the balance, and then when we're peaking on wind or solar, you don't use that gas. That's a perfect example of using a conventional, very, very conventional fossil-based resource in combination to solve a problem around intermittency that allows a portfolio solution. So.
Yeah, and when you say about merging the two together, I guess the question is what do you mean exactly? So at some level you have at the national grid level where it is merged in to the network as a whole, and it is an important part in many countries of overall production of electricity. If you're moving it down a level outside of national grids, I mean, we have partners today who are working on solar PV and diesel genset combination hybrid systems. What are the applications for these? It's mining companies who are remote located and don't have access to grid network. And the cost of transporting diesel is more expensive than the cost of putting solar PV panels there. The diesel's there as a backup or as a baseline inside of that power system. This business model is being looked at quite seriously for, let's say, emerging middle classes and parts of the world that are not also have the electricity at their back door, or reliable sources of electricity at their back door. So we are seeing those business models happen.
Okay. Are we in a either renewables or conventional energy world, or are we in a both renewables and conventional energy world? Because the message we continue to get is that it's either this or that, especially in the developing world. where renewables are not integrated into the national grids. It's either this or that. I'm kind of asking, is it time to now start focusing on a both and world in which both are suggested by both parties?
Well, that's what I was saying at the start. I think if you look at Germany as an example, there's been massive promotion of renewables in Germany over the past couple of decades. It's been very successful, but you've now shown the limits of that because you cause inefficiencies and stranded costs in the mainstream power sector, and it's not really sustainable. There needs to be a solution found. So one of the next challenges, the big challenges for the next wave, is better integration of the current energy kind of sector, if you like, with renewables. Renewables has, if you like, come of age. It's reached the stage where it's gone beyond, where it can be treated as a special kind of case where it's subsidized directly, and we don't worry about the externalities. Now we need to kind of really kind of work to fully integrate it into the mainstream power sector, because we can't get any significant further build out of renewables unless we do it. So together they'll go forward hand in hand. I mean, the dream of people like General Electric and others has always been, the combination, and a lot of the energy companies, is a combination of kind of, gas-fired combined cycles covering the intermittency, and the rest is solar and wind. As we say, that got disrupted by shale gas. But, that integration has to be a lot tighter, whether it's microgeneration, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa, where you're using wind to fill in around the variable costs of the oil burners on the sector, remote mining sites, all of these areas, the integration is the key to getting kind of a lower carbon energy sector and much more build out.
I'm looking forward to the day where I can write a case study on something we're doing right now, which is exactly what Scott said, in a developing country, which is just integrating a diesel genset with solar PV to perform a very specific function in a very specific location that meets the needs of that place. And it's absolutely one and the other. I think the only thing that I don't know, and I agree that with an earlier comment that, even at absolute levels, renewables and solar in particular are sort of a pimple on the back of conventional energy production, but at some point the climate system may speak out and have its voice heard, and I think maybe we're seeing signs of that, but we're not, we're still not fully absorbing the consequences that one and the other are actually linked. And yes, there's a transition period and we need to make things work together, and hopefully at some point later, storage appears to be the sort of panacea for intermittent renewables. Let's see. I think there are plenty of companies out there trying to solve that problem as well, and if the VCs are brave enough to stick their money into that, who have stuck their money into things like fully electric aspirational cars at very expensive prices, then we might yet solve the problem. But I think climate is something we haven't really talked about enough today.
Last comment from Ian.
There were a few levels to your question, I think. So technical integration into grids is a big issue, and people are doing lots of good technical work on that front. Commercial integration into the energy system, because renewables becomes a bigger part of it, is also an issue. So we think fixed feed-in tariffs are a thing of the past, and that if you're a renewable energy generator, you will need to commercially place your power in the grid in the future, and that's a good thing, and that will enhance efficiency. Thermodynamically, the problem is with fossil fuels, you get your storage wrapped in with your energy, and with wind and solar, you don't. And that compromises your ability to operate in different places and in different times, which is what you want to do with your energy. So I think we can live with the developing world emitting a bit, so they have integrated systems, so they can have the energy when they need it. In my opinion, I think there's a few of us have a bit of work to do before we have to worry about too much of that.
Right, panel, thank you very much for your insights. That's all we have time for today. Audience, could we give them a round of applause, please?